Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to our presentation today about advocacy, how it works and why it matters. My name is Sean Blinn. I work with various historic houses in New Jersey, also serve on some local and county government historic preservation and advisory boards. Can everybody hear me? All right, we're all good. We like our AV system now. So we all know that museums are frequently pressed for cash, government support is seemingly under constant threat, and that the rationale for government spending on museums is often under attack. It's obviously a source of immense frustration for many of us, but the three of us are here today to show that we can do something about it. And that our position is also that advocacy is not just something that we can do, but something that we really should and must do. All of us, can make the case for museums with government officials at all levels, both in general in terms of museums as a field, but also in terms of we can advocate on behalf of our own specific museums. We will hear from three people today. We'll first hear from Celeste DeWald, who is the Executive Director of the California Association of Museums. She'll provide information about issues that museums face and how governments can help be part of the solution. We'll also hear from Claire Bleckman from the Peabody Essex Museum. Claire has been a longtime participant in AAM's annual Advocacy Day, and she also is active in local and regional advocacy projects. Claire and I will alternate a bit with me providing some commentary and insight on what people in government look for and how to tell the story to government. And I do want to say that any positions that we express here are not necessarily those of our organizations that we work for and purely represent our own opinions. #disclaimer. So before we get started, here's an easy tool to find out who represents you. It's at least it works if you live in the United States. So if you text your zip code to 520-200-2223, it will send you back a message that will include your senators, your member of Congress, your state senator, state representatives, and their phone numbers. It doesn't provide emails. But it does provide names, and it provides that phone number because the very first step of knowing how to advocate is knowing who to advocate with. So first, let's turn it over to Celeste.
Great. Thank you, Sean. As Sean mentioned, we're coming at this, the three of us have very kind of distinct, kind of different perspectives to look at advocacy. And I think that's great because there's lots of different ways that you can be an advocate for museums or for your point of view, and I think it's really refreshing that we're kind of giving three different views. I'm looking at it very much from the perspective of advocating for the field, for the museum field, from mostly kind of an association collective effort, and also from an institutional perspective, not necessarily individuals. I was joking with myself on the way up here that I'm the boomer on the table. So that's me. And my teenage daughters call me boomer all the time, which I'm not. I'm Gen X, but that's fine. Whatever. I told them, I said, if you can decide what the age range is of boomers, I've decided it's anybody over 12. So anyway, which they didn't find the humor in that at all. But anyway, I've been with the California Association of Museums for 15 years now, and we are very active in legislative affairs. We have a lobbyist in Sacramento that represents the interests of the museum field. I serve on the board of the Coalition of State Museum Associations. So I'm also active on a national level of knowing what the role is or what the role can be of state museum associations in advocating for the museum field. So I'm going to kind of look at it with that hat on. How many people here are from California, just so I can kind of get a sense of the room? One, okay. So every state is different. Every state is different, so I'm going to try to present that every state is different in my presentation. How many of you have met with elected officials before? Okay, so about half-half. Okay. I'm also, as this slide indicates, I'm looking at this front as a very basic introductory level. So bear with me, those of you who have experience, just bear with me in knowing that I'm trying to create a baseline approach. Okay, so first, let's dispel the myth that nonprofits cannot lobby. I still get this question all the time. I serve on a board, and we're in a rural area, and we're being told that we can't lobby. That's not true. Museums can lobby. There are just some rules that you have to follow to make sure that you're in compliance. So as my slide here indicates, charitable nonprofits, which are most museums are 501c3s, cannot engage in political campaign activity. So that means you can't be partisan, you can't support one elected official over another. You have to really kind of stay out of elections in terms of electing somebody for public office. You are allowed and you are encouraged to lobby and engage in legislative activities. The question is how much of that can you do? You would have to do a lot of lobbying and a lot of legislative work to hurt your tax-exempt status. But the problem is that the IRS's kind of rule for that, or kind of rule of thumb, is it has to be insignificant, which is not necessarily defined for most 501c3s. So it just has to be an insubstantial amount of your nonprofit's activities as lobbying. If you are nervous about the amount of energy that your nonprofit is doing, you actually can do what's called take the H election, which basically means you fill out a different form and you track what you spend in terms of your lobbying and your grassroots advocacy work. We're a 501c3, and that's what we do. So when we send out a call to action to our members, a portion of our communications manager's time is put into our lobby tracking sheet, and we report that to the state. So yes, museums can lobby, but inform yourself and make sure that your leadership is aware. And I say that because if you are an institution that is taking the H election, then you have to track what you're doing in terms of your lobbying. But we definitely encourage you. And I gave you a handout that is a handout from the National Council of Nonprofits that really can kind of help articulate the important role that we can play in advocating. I think also all of us are going to touch on this to some degree. I also want to say, though, that according to some research that that AAM has done, American Alliance of Museums, that 97% of Americans believe that museums are educational assets for their communities. I would say that if 97% of Americans believe that, then we kind of have a role to play in being public education. So if your government cares about something like climate change or equal rights, then we as public education institutions have a role to play in that. So in educating the public about those topics. So we're a powerful conduit for public education. Okay, where can you start? I'm going to start here, and then I'm going to go a little bit deeper. Very basic level, if you aren't already receiving advocacy alerts from AAM, or you're not already receiving advocacy alerts from your state museum association, and in some areas, regionals also play this role if there's not a state museum association. But we associations, we're built to be sort of these collective effort groups for advocacy. So pay attention, sign up for our alerts and pay attention to what we're pushing out there and what we're asking you to do. If you are looking to be an advocate for the museum field and your museum, I would say ask your leadership what the protocol is for responding to legislative calls to action. Most often, I've heard, leadership is usually like, great, you want to be involved in this? Great. Please respond to this call to action when AAM does it or when the State Museum Association does. But just make sure that they are aware that you're doing it on behalf of your institution. Don't go rogue. Because like I said, some museums are tracking what they're doing, and also you don't want to get fired. So definitely make sure that your leadership is comfortable with you doing that. And if they have somebody else that's that role, sometimes it's a development person, but if somebody else is supposed to respond to these calls to action, then ask them what you can do to help. And are there mechanisms in place to track your organization's lobbying activity? So these are all kind of good questions to ask. Once you have all of that clarified, though, take action. Like, if there's one thing that I want you to walk out of here today, is that if you are, empowered to take action, take action. When our association, when AAM and others send out calls to action, it's really frustrating when we only get 10 people respond. So I'm looking at each of you. I want each of you to realize that these calls to action are talking to you, and don't just assume that somebody else is going to do it. I would also encourage you to ask to attend AAM's Advocacy Day. All of us have participated in AAM's Advocacy Day or your State Museum Association's Lobby Day, and it's a great training opportunity to get aware of what the issues are and get used to doing it in kind of a group environment, because it can be a little bit scary if you're doing it on your own, and on these days you don't feel alone at all. You feel like you're part of a community advocating for yourselves. So Museums Advocacy Day is usually in February. It is spearheaded by the American Alliance of Museums, but there are many of state, regional, and national museum associations that also sign on as full partners. So for example, my association, California Association of Museums, has been a sponsor and a partner of Museums Advocacy Day for over 10 years, since they started doing them again. What I often hear is from why people don't participate is this: my museum doesn't receive IMLS funding, so we don't participate because we don't have any skin in the game. Well, I would say there's a lot more at stake than just IMLS funding. It is true we only have competitive grant programs through IMLS, which is really important for the field, but here is a list of a lot of other subjects that you would be advocating for if you went to Museums Advocacy Day. Charitable giving, a lot of museums are dealing with the standardized deduction issues right now. Elementary and secondary education, kind of what the federal government does in that arena. I would advocate that that's more important at the state level, but yeah. Public service loan forgiveness. I mean, how many people do we know that are entering the field with significant student debt? So that's a really important subject matter. I would also say funding for other federal agencies other than IMLS, like NEA, NEH, National Science Foundation. This affects federal funding for these entities, doesn't just affect them at the federal level, it also affects your states, because it affects the funding for your Arts Council and your Humanities Council. Also, some policy making, like protection of cultural property. I'm not going to dive into any of these in great detail, but AEM has a really great website where it does dive into these more deeply. So if you go online and you look at these slides and you click on more information, it'll take you to that page. So about half of state museum associations have active advocacy programs. So not every single one does, but about half of them do. So that means about 20, 25 of them, 26. And some of them have lobby days or advocacy days like they have at AEM. In California, because that's really the one that I can speak of in great detail, is we've done it differently in different years. Sometimes we've done advocacy days where we invite our members to it. It kind of depends on what's at stake. Last year, we partnered with the Californians for the Arts on their Arts Advocacy Day, and also celebrated Arts, Culture, and Creativity Month with them. And it's pretty. This is pretty common that you'll find that the state museum associations might partner with the Arts Advocacy Group or the Humanities Group. It kind of depends on where there's more pressure at the state level. So which state entities interact with museums the most. So this is a picture of our poster from Arts Advocacy Day, and some of our board members. We actually, our board members have a separate lobby day than our advocacy day that allows us to focus in on deep dive with specific key legislators. Some of the issues, it's different in every state, so it's really hard for me to kind of give you a snapshot of what it looks like on a national level in terms of what's going on in states. But listen to these statistics, because I think I am going to get on kind of my soapbox and say how important it is that we pay attention at the state level of what's going on. Half of members of Congress were state legislators first. So if you look at this as kind of, educating state legislators about museums before they get to the federal level, that's pretty important to be able to educate half of them in advance. And there's also, for every bill that passed the U.S. Congress, there were 23 bills that passed state legislature. So in 2014, 185 bills. 4 months? Okay, yeah. 185 bills passed the Congress. The average state passed 462. So if you really want to look at what's going to impact museums, it's happening, a lot of it's happening at the state level. So as I mentioned, appropriations for state agencies are some of the issues. Educational standards, a lot of those are set at the state level. State bonds or funding measures. This is a hot topic in California because we can get funding, capital project funding for museums through statewide bonds. And also, this just touches on some of the topics that are in laws that are in the legislature here in California: property tax exemption, repatriation of native remains, classification of protections concerning summer camps, which affects museum summer camp programs, charitable giving, employment law, and contractor classification. So each state's going to be different, but these are kind of, it's got a broad range. For me, from my perspective, this is what effective advocacy looks like. Diverse group of individuals from across the state having a conversation about the impact their museum has on their community. And if this dialogue is not taking place, then laws that are being created without our input. And I know that our other presenters here are going to touch on that as well. I also like that this has kind of a community aspect to it, not people doing it on their own. So your typical advocacy or lobby day includes training, so they want you to be prepared, so it includes training. So this might be an all day or it might be just in the morning. I would also say if you are meeting with an elected official, there is a certain part of research that you should do in advance, like coordinating with the other meeting participants. Who's going to talk about what topic? Who's going to give examples of their programs or exhibitions to underscore the need for this, for the educator, or the elected official to take a particular action? Have they supported museums in the past? It's always great to start a meeting with a thank you. And it also shows that their actions are being watched and you're paying attention to them. This slide too, AEM's website is just a wealth of information. As I mentioned before, they have policy issue briefs on the federal issues. They've got a lot of great information, infographics. They've got templates on economic and educational impact samples and templates. They've got training videos on their YouTube channel. They really have some fabulous information if you're just getting started. I will save this for the end since I'm short on time. I have just a short, oftentimes when you go to a museum's advocacy day, you also get to hear wonderful things about museums, and it's great hearing that from elected officials. So if we have time at the very end, I'll play this for you. If not, this is on AEM's YouTube channel. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so let's get all my business in a row here. What Celeste has been describing is a very formal mode of participating in government lobbying. It's effective, we should be doing it. But I'm here to talk about more informal ways of doing advocacy, of using our institutional power and building soft power to make things happen for your museum and the communities that you serve. So here's my soapbox slide. Museums are not neutral. We say this a lot now, but it remains important philosophy, and you'll still have to overcome some resistance to this idea. We know that, the quote is, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. But also I take comfort in the fact that like these are times of great moral clarity right now. Like we know what the right thing is to do, and we can do it. We cannot pretend that we're above what's happening in our state houses in Washington or on the streets. We can't ignore our power as institutions to do something about that injustice. And so we have to actively fight for our values, for our budgets, and for our people, because if we don't fight, then people that don't share our values, they sure will. They're out there. So the soapbox bit is just, I want people to not just advocate for the status quo, because IMLS funding is good, and it should continue, but what does your grant matter if your museum is underwater or if it's on fire in a wildfire? And charitable deductions might put some money directly in your museum's pockets, but what good is that if you don't have state-funded services like water, or if the private utility companies are shutting off the power for 500,000 people because they've neglected their upgrades? Like, there's a larger emergency at hand here. And lastly, I'd like to point out that we have literal concentration camps on our borders. So how can we celebrate and exhibit the art of Indigenous people and Latin American people when we're undoubtedly keeping artists in camp and separating them from their families? So in general, what I want is for you to broaden your definition of a museum issue when you're thinking about your activism. So these might seem like daunting issues to address, but I'm here to tell you that we can do it, and that institutional power is real, and you have it. Museums are rich in resources. We have lots of tools, and let's use them. Your museum might have some money. My museum has a $500 million endowment, so, you know, there's that. We have prestige, we have constituent goodwill, and no one in government hates museums. As we said, people in the United States generally agree with what a museum is doing. And we also have a large platform of people we've built up that goodwill with. We have people resources internally, too. We have board members, we have artists who know how to make like compelling statements. We have donors, we have members, we have graphic designers, we have people who can do research really well. These are all useful tools for advocacy. All right, so your first step to exercising that institutional power I'm talking about is to assess the conditions that you're working under. And there is a very powerful framework for figuring out why state actors do what they do. It's called analysis of material conditions. And so your local politicians don't make the decisions they do because they're assholes or because they're stupid. They don't make them because, on the other hand, if they're like moral and believe in human rights and all that stuff. They make decisions they do because there is some material benefit, either real or perceived. And the key is to figure out what material benefits they care about most, what material benefits you can offer, your museum can offer to the community. Some of these material benefits might need to get reported, but right now we're just talking about the analysis. And a very good method for analyzing the material conditions is to buckle down and read the whole budget. It's very illuminating, and other than zoning, budgets are probably the most obvious battleground in our government. So, because what you spend your money on is your priority, full stop. And here's a pie chart I like to put up of federal government spending in 2016. Do you see the tiny sliver of blue at the arrow is pointing to at the top there? No? That makes sense. No, the resolution's not great, but still, that tiny sliver is the entire funding for the NEA, NEH, and Corporation for Public Broadcasting combined as compared to the federal budget. And budgets are the least sexy part of government, but they are the most crucial, and you can make a big impact here, especially on the local level. You can ask for money to be spent on things that help your community and your museum. This is easy to justify, and a little can go a long way. And so pay attention to where the money is being spent, because again, politicians will say they support things, but if they don't put the money where their mouth is, that's not really support, is it? I don't particularly care if my congressperson speaks at a march about the climate emergency. I care if they voted to increase military funding by $700 billion, because the US military is the #1 polluter on Earth. So if we're spending money on that, are we spending money on upgrading our power grid, that kind of stuff? Some towns have participatory budgeting, so if you have participatory budgeting, please participate in it. And we can move on with that. In Muse Tech, we know that people make the interactives, people make the algorithms, and tech doesn't make itself. And so similarly, people make government. And so we need to be able to influence the people that are doing that, influence their thoughts and their decisions. Relationships are an area where museums excel. We are good at making deep personal connections. And we know the importance of doing this and sustaining these relationships with members and visitors. So we want to know You want to know who these people are that you are advocating with and make them have goodwill towards you. I argue that the most productive relationships you can build is with the staff. The politician is the face, but he's not the one. He's the one that runs for office, but it's the staff who set the meetings, write the briefs, draft the legislation. They have their politician's ear. And often these are young adults, they're idealistic, maybe they're underpaid, but they need to hear from you, who are the experts in your field, about what's happening. This is a picture of a staff member for Seth Moulton, who is the congressman from my museums district. She's enjoying an art exhibition at PEM with all the balloons. This is the only time you got me to go into the balloon room because I knew I had to form a relationship with this woman, and I think she was impressed. It was fun. So for both staff and politicians, a key part of relationship building is to get them in the door, because you have cool stuff, and you have compelling stories at your museum, and they should see those in person and feel them in person. You have a beautiful venue space, so maybe ask them to speak at non-political events. This is a picture of the mayor with our director and board director at the anchor drop. We had a 4,400-pound anchor that we had taken away to do some construction, and they put it back outside, and this was a big deal to the people in town. So she came and gave a speech. Everyone's real happy about it, kind of local goodwill being built up here. Consider also leveraging your board. Oh, that should be a GIF. Why is it not GIFing? That's so rude. He dances. It's a great GIF. Anyway, so your board is made up of probably wealthy, powerful people with connections of their own. Maybe they have shitty politics, but one assumes that if they're on your board, they care about what happens to the museum. So they need to call up their buddies from the country club, from the banks, other institutions in town. They need to spread the good word about the museum, about what your asks are for government. And yeah, there's a good old boy network, and it's gross that it exists, but you can leverage it with your board members. And lastly, representative democracy is a numbers game. And if you don't have the money to spend, or you're not allowed to spend it on politicians, then you need the bodies to bring to the table. So who in your area shares your values? Build some coalitions. Are there more museums? Are there libraries? Are there nonprofits? Are you in your state and regional advocacy association? They might be advocating already, but as Celeste says, maybe they're overburdened. Maybe they need some help. Maybe they need you to respond to their calls. Do they email you asking you to show up to Advocacy Day? And I will say that nothing about my job, I'm the digital asset manager. I don't have anything to do with lobbying in general, but I said, I want to show up, and I did, and it works. You're a voter, you're a constituent, do it. So if you build your coalitions, you have to commit to them. Don't break a promise. Always show up in solidarity. If they need you to help with something, you come out for them, and they'll come out for you. That's the point of solidarity. So next is Sean.
Well, thank you, everybody. Again, I want to reiterate that my opinions are personal opinions and not necessarily those of any particular governmental body. Disclaimer, disclaimer, disclaimer. But I do want to talk about my own experience, both as a museum professional and as somebody who has actually served on some town boards. I have thankfully never been an elected official. But I've worked with historic preservation commissions. I work with my county's Cultural and Heritage Commission. So it's a whole bunch of other things. If I say what Claire said about zoning getting people fired up, yeah.
Zoning is big business.
Zoning is big business. When you start getting death threats from it, you're on to somebody. So, but what I do want to talk about, most government does not result in that kind of thing happening, so it's mostly harmless. But as much as, federal government gets all the attention, Celeste talked about how there's much more going on at the state level, but don't ignore your local and your county governments either, because that in most places is where zoning is controlled. It's generally not a federal or a state issue, with some exceptions. County and local governments often have significant grant money. The budgets aren't as large as the federal government, but local officials are your neighbors. These are the people that you will bump into in the supermarket. These are the people who you will see running around town. They're the people, you'll have a much greater opportunity to influence them and to get to have a real conversation and build that relationship with your local and with your local and county government officials than you would with anybody, likely even at the state level, certainly at the federal level. So we've talked about the democratic process, and as much as we usually think about the democratic process as the democracy part and going in and voting on election day, which I hope everybody did, it is as much about the process as it is about the democracy. It's one of those things people don't necessarily always see. The government is about rules, it's about regulations, it's about process, much more so than what we're used to in, certainly in the nonprofit world, but even in the for-profit world. It's, defined processes, there are timelines, there are rules and regulations. They tend to exist, the ideal, and it's not always an ideal that's met, but the ideal is that these processes and regulations exist to ensure equal treatment from anybody who comes before government, that government is not allowed to play favorites. We can't just give the budget to such and so because we like them. We can't have pay-to-play contracting. That's why these procedural and processes exist. So taking some time to understand the process can help you navigate it. And what Claire said about working with staff is absolutely essential. The staff can be your allies in helping to navigate the process. If they're not your allies, they can help cut red tape, but make certain that it's cut lengthwise, and you will rue the day that you were not nice to staff. So definitely be nice to the staff. But do try to understand the process and understand that it is generally there for a reason, and it is just assume it's going to be there and work to navigate it as best you can. So what makes government work? A lot of government is about balancing competing interests, and it's about making tough choices among many good and worthy projects. We all believe in our museum's missions. We believe in what we're doing. We believe in why we're here. But everybody else who's out there looking for support from government also believes in their projects. And when there's a limited amount of money to go around, that's when government has to make tough choices among several different projects, all of which are equally worthy. Government balances our interests and our desires versus other organizations. The Recreation Committee that wants additional funding for a ball field, for example. Government also feels pressure from the taxpayers and the voters to say, well, we don't mind that you're spending money on museums, we mind more that you're spending money at all. People will want their taxes a little lower or maybe not spend on something else. So that's what government is about. And it's about balancing competing interests and making those tough choices. Also keep in mind that especially at the local level, at the county level, and amongst appointed officials, people may not be getting paid, or they may only be getting paid for expenses. A lot of people are there simply because they believe in the mission. They have a goal of public service, and they're certainly not in it for the money. They take the role seriously, and that includes trying to apply the process as fairly and evenly as possible. I do also want to mention appointed officials, that as much as a lot of attention goes towards elected officials, don't ignore appointed officials and the boards and the commissions that they all serve on. As I mentioned, historic preservation commissions and county arts councils, they control budgets, they control grants. These are smaller than federal, but they can often be really quite significant, and the reporting requirements are often less too, just a little side benefit. In addition to that, it's the local and county officials and the appointed officials who, the elected officials will look to for advice. The elected officials may ratify the budget, but a lot of the decisions are made by an appointed commission, so don't ignore them. They can be powerful allies when it comes time to go to talk with your elected officials. One thing that we've all touched on is that our main role is to participate. I'm going to quote The West Wing, and that President Bartlett said that decisions are made by those who show up. My own corollary is decisions are made by those who show up about those who don't show up. My experience in government is that people don't show up. Public meetings are often very lightly attended, especially at the local level and especially for appointed boards rather than elected officials. People may attend a meeting if there's an issue in town that directly affects them. It's either whatever it is. But otherwise, the audience can be somewhere between thin and non-existent. So this is a graph that I made up showing participation over the years that I've been in government. It doesn't include zoning boards, where, yes, it is a contact sport. And as much as it can be a little hard to read, the x-axis is the year, going back to 2005. The y-axis is the total number of people who showed up at those meetings throughout each year just to pay attention to what's going on in their communities. And yes, that ranges from a low of 0 to a high of 2. So that's 3 people in about 15 years. And that banging sound is Alexis de Tocqueville turning over in his grave. But the thing is that that big, giant, honking space in the center where nobody comes to a meeting, this can actually create an opportunity for us when we do participate. So imagine you're that one person, and that first person who showed up, about 10 years ago, showed up, didn't say anything, left. We never heard from him again. But imagine that you show up. As we've all said, we show up with an agenda. We show up having prepared. We show up with an appointment. We show up knowing the issues. We show up with our data briefs. And we have something, or we show up to meetings simply to provide an update about our museum. We've done this awesome thing. We've worked with children. We've worked with underserved communities. Give a quick update, just a minute or two. Invite them to your major events. Talk to them about the communities that you serve and your mission. Keep it concise. Keep it focused, but show up and tell them. They will get to know you over time. And now imagine that all of us do this. And Celeste said that it's a little disappointing when you send the email out to the entire state or the entire country and 10 people do this. So again, there's safety in numbers. When we all show up and we all advocate, then people will notice that museum people have something to say. Maybe we ought to listen. Some things that don't help quite as much are, yes, come to the meetings, send out all your information, but don't just stop at mailing out a postcard to your elected officials or to your county committees. Everybody does that. So imagine everybody here sends in their postcard once a month. You get a massive pile of correspondence about this thick, and you kind of flip through it. Everybody read the correspondence, we'll pass it around. So it helps to make that personal connection. The best flyer for the best program will get lost in the shuffle. That's the benefit of going to public meetings, presenting this information in person so that you can give them quick updates, you can invite them to your events, and you can start to make that difference and build that relationship. The other part of benefit of going to public meetings and talking with people is Claire talked about coalition partners, and going to public meetings is a good place to find them. When you go to public gatherings and there's a bunch of museums or other historic associations or arts associations or other nonprofits whose missions may overlap with us, it's a good place to go, meet people, find out the issues. It's as much about listening as it is about talking. This is where we find out what's going on in the community and find out who is thinking what. It's a great way to build a network and to increase your own credibility. So what does government look for? Well, statistics. We all know that anybody who's ever filled out a grant report knows all the statistics, all the numbers, all the math. It makes us crazy. But it's the language of government because they are dealing with many, many, many different issues. And so being able to show quantifiable results is shorthand. It's a quick summary. It's a good way to, it's what government looks for, and being able to quantify your museum story is a good way to speak governmentese. Here's just one example, and again, Celeste mentioned the AAM templates, and I definitely want to second that recommendation. The AAM website has some terrific templates. This is just one. It's their overview information sheet just about museums in general, showing that across the United States, museums contribute $50 billion in economic activity, that we create 726,000 jobs, and that grabs people. It gets their attention. It is something that they have other templates as well, economic impact statements, social impact statements. The Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival in New York has a lengthy educational statement. Look for good examples. Customize them for your own museum, of course. Keep them brief. No more than a single two-sided sheet of paper. So if you've got 3 or 4 pages worth, make it 1 sheet's worth. Again, if people in government have questions, they'll ask. Have the backstory in the back of your mind, and be prepared to answer any questions. But lead with something brief and concise. And these really do work. I know all of us can probably tell stories about having meetings with people who may not necessarily come in as museum supporters or spending on museum supporters, but when they see quantifiable data like this, this is an easy way to make the sale. I've gotten comments from congressional staff, from elected officials, that say that this kind of summary actually does do an amazing job in getting our mission, our information across. So some things to include, again, we probably all, at a basic level, the number of visitors, number of school children. I know in New Jersey, they look for a separate count of number of children, number of schools, number of school groups. All these need to be separated out for whatever reason. Financial impact. Don't forget that your museum spending, as much as Claire said, it's a moral document. Our budgets are also, we're job creators. Everybody that works for us is a job, that's a job we've created. Every dollar that we spend in our communities is measurable impact, so you can include that information. And of course, if you're doing innovative programming, include that in any summaries that you bring to government officials. We talked about, Celeste mentioned 97% support for museums, but that it does mean that we're going to run into that 3% who doesn't agree with us. And it's also that some parts of that need to be convinced. Not everybody supports large government or supports government spending on to support charities. That people on more conservative members of government will tend to say, well, they're not opposed to museums. Support for museums is pretty much universal across the ideological spectrum, but if people simply believe in a smaller role for government, or that government shouldn't pick winners and losers, then having this quantifiable information can actually be really effective in reaching them and saying, okay, you may not think this, but here's the amount of jobs we create. So again, this can actually work in reaching people who might start off a little skeptical. If you're in a
Time check, 15 minutes.
okay, yeah. So I'll do be focused. I was about to say be focused and concise, so I'll skip that slide. Remember that this is an ongoing thing. It's about ongoing work in building relationships. It is, if you remember that one guy who showed up for one meeting about 10 years ago, well, nobody else does either, so don't be that guy. And keep at it, build the relationships, do the work, and that is the most effective thing you can do, is simply participate and keep at it. So with that, any questions? Yes?
Yeah, I was,
Can you speak into the mic, Chair?
oh yeah. I'm gonna sit down. I'm not gonna just like awkwardly stand here. Yeah, so I was actually originally going to ask about museums stepping into local government before you started talking, Sean, because in my spare time, I am involved with zoning issues, upzone your neighborhoods and single-family zoning. And I live in DC, and so that's like a hot issue around increasing density and stuff. But I was just going to ask about have any of you have experience about encouraging museums to advocate about like intensely local issues like zoning or more mass transit or increased minimum wages and stuff like that, because these are the kind of things that keep diverse audiences from being able to come into our museums because they can't access them physically or otherwise don't have the economic ability to come. And I think museums can play a real role in like forcing that stuff in. I just didn't know if you had any experience with that.
Well, I think that this is, I haven't specifically done these within my museum. I've kept it mostly to AM situations, but I think that this is part of a larger project to make your museum understand that these local issues are important and just as important as IMLS funding. I know that there's often things like local boards, like the preservation committee and stuff, that the museum is like, oh, we have an issue before we have a historic house before the board there, that kind of thing. I do think that we are on a commuter rail line and they have a $10 weekend pass thing, and I think that it would be good to bring that up to my board of directors and be like, hey, this is a thing that helps people. Get people up from Boston to come to Salem, and having the $10 commuter rail pass made it a lot easier. So short answer, no, but we would like to. Do you have anything else to say?
I could add a little bit. Actually, you've got. Oh, I've got mine. Yes, right. I need to take it. I think that the museums that I've seen that have gotten involved in local government issues are museums that are usually associated with local government. So we have about 1 out of every 5 museums in the state of California are not private nonprofits. They have some sort of city or county that they're aligned with, and they usually have those lines of communication are pretty open because they're already within the structure. I would say that. I would say it's a tougher sell for the private nonprofits because usually what gets them out and at these meetings are usually when it has to do with funding. So whether that has to do with a direct funding grant program or it has to do with maybe an admissions tax, like they do not like admission tax, I know that. It's usually when it affects them directly, they'll do that. I thought that a real missed opportunity in the state of California was several years ago, we changed the way that schools, the funding mechanism for schools was more money went to the local government, the local school board, and less was from the state. But the amount that was given had to do with the number of second language learners or English language learners or those in poverty, so that the school districts that had more challenging issues in terms of their student population got a bigger piece of the pie, got more money. But it also required that the local school board have a 5-year plan of how they were going to use that money, and they had to do town hall programs, and they essentially had to listen to what the local community was, what their input was. I did not see, it happened on a really tight timeline, and I did not see very many museums participate in that, even though I was a cheerleader going, please go to these meetings, because that was an opportunity for them to really make an impact on a local level. I knew the timing was right, and I was a volunteer for the California Alliance for Arts Education, and in our local school district, we went from 0 art teachers to 14 art teachers because the timing was right. So if there's a way that you could just kind of line that up and have your ear to the ground and you're like, this isn't about funding, but this is a huge opportunity, and kind of make that sell, it kind of needs champions within the museum to make that case.
And from my own experience, both doing this and seeing other people do this, is what can be helpful is to go to other organizations' events. So if you work with the History Museum and the local and local Arts Council is having a public visioning session, just show up. They may invite you anyway, but just make certain to be one of the people who participates in those type of events or community organizing events. And that once we as museum professionals and museums as organizations, once we get out into the community, it's not just about we've talked about working with government, but it is also getting out into the community and making those connections in the community so that they know we're on their side. That bit of representation representing the museum in the community is a good way to show support, but it also, over time, it can help build those connections as those organizations will start to bring people into the museum. So it's a way to advocate. It's also a way to continue to build the coalitions that we need.
You can run the mic for more questions. Just think about it for a second.
We can't have answered every question.
If you want to put up the discussion questions, maybe?
We can, or we can, yeah. So we just have we do have a couple of questions here that if we want to break down, or if we just want to call something out, because we're a fairly small group here, to think about what your board members are comfortable with doing. So your board is, AAM has an article about your board as your secret weapon. Think about the political terrain, examine your own capacity, and then to take an inventory of assets you already have. So does anybody want to share any of this that you can think of?
Not to be the person who's
Go for it.
But actually, in terms of political terrain, I was wondering if you guys could, you mentioned PSLF, public service loan forgiveness, as a thing worth advocating for. And I was curious because that's a really interesting issue, because a lot of budgetary stuff lives with Congress, which is great because you're not at the whim of the executive being one party or another, particularly one party that doesn't want to fund arts things. But with PSLF, that's kind of directly controlled by the executive. And I don't know if people know what's going on with that right now, but a lot of people who meet the criteria for 10 years of public service and they've approved less than 1% of the people who qualify since 2016. And so I was curious about if you could just talk about advocacy in the age of being under, for those types of things where the executive has, or a mayor in the case of a city, has a lot of power over a thing and they're just intransigent about it, and then is it not even worth advocating at that point because they're not going to change their minds because it's such an ideological issue, as opposed to with Congress where it's oh, well, at the end of the day, the House and the Senate have to agree on the federal budget, and so it's a lot easier to get things put in for museums.
It's always worth advocating.
So I have sat in on meetings where I know I'm not going to change their mind that the federal government, or in my case, the state government, should fund museums, because I know that that's not part of their ideology. But I still go through the motions because I think it's still important to make that point. And I usually tend to focus on the things that I know that they care about, like the local economy, like trying to produce more in taxes or for the economy, like that information about in the handout that I gave about tourism, tourists that go for culture tend to spend more money. Like that, I've seen that have traction before. So I think it's really, I think it's always worth it. I wouldn't give up on anybody. I also think that sometimes it's just finding the right person to twist their arm. So there is, and sometimes that those are not very, you have to kind of put feelers out and figure out where that is. Like, for example, we have, I don't know if you've seen one on California roads while you're here, because there's only one Californian, but the Snoopy license plate. Has anybody seen a Snoopy license plate? No, everybody's shaking their head. Okay, so the Snoopy license plate is actually a special interest license plate that actually funds museums in the state of California. And we had a bill that was going to, there's 11,000 on the road, on California roads, but we had a bill that was essentially needed to pass the state legislature in order for that program to move forward. And it was, at that point, there was not a supermajority in the state legislature, so meaning that we needed to get some Republicans to vote for it. And because it was a 2/3 bill, it was an urgency bill. And do you know that it came down to the executive director of a very small museum in Modesto having been in a rock climbing competition for a different nonprofit's fundraiser, where he beat her, the elected official beat her, that she was able to go into that meeting and say, okay, now that you've beat me and you embarrassed me, this is what I want. I want you to vote for this bill. It comes down to that. It really does. So, maybe you may have allies in ways that you just don't know yet.
And when it comes to public loan forgiveness, I have to say, one of my friends is one of the 96 people who got her loans forgiven, $50,000 worth. So if you want to talk to me about that after, we can talk more about how she did that.
I was just going to expand upon that as well. I'm on PSLF. I work for a nonprofit. Of course, when all the stories started coming out about the low rates of actual loan forgiveness, freaked out, understandably so. It's less about executives not wanting to do it and more about the user interface of the way that it's actually done. That's a place where I think the advocacy could be a bit more internal, just in terms of making sure we're actually helping our employees know how to get recertified, et cetera. But I would also argue that that's one of the places where I, as a person who works in a museum and a nonprofit, but who isn't an executive, actually feel as if I have a place to engage in personal advocacy as well, because I think part of it can become much more powerful when I, as a person that says, hi, I'm a human and I benefit from this and I vote, can go to those places and do something like that. And I'm curious, actually, there is a question in here, I promise, where it seems like a little bit of a gray area as someone who, as a citizen who benefits from a federal program like PSLF, were I to go to a place and advocate, even as an employee of a nonprofit, are there lines that we have to toe when we work in these spaces, but are also individuals with agency of our own? And can you maybe speak to whether there needs to be caution or anything along those lines as we advocate for our personal beliefs?
I think that you should advocate for what you care about. No, I'm not up here saying don't advocate for what you as an individual care about. I would say if you're doing it on behalf of your organization, just make sure you go through the proper channels. That's all.
Yeah. And I completely agree. And I think that's time. So I'm here for the rest of the conference, but thank you all for coming and attending today, and hope to see you in the halls of our own all of our legislative bodies, and see you all in Washington at Advocacy Day next February. So,
Thank you.
Thanks very much.